Rain hammered the glass of the G Group tower like someone impatiently knocking for an answer. Inside the lobby, umbrellas bloomed and collapsed in a chaotic garden of navy and black. Song Yan jogged through the storm, hair plastered to her forehead, her tote bag bouncing against her hip, and something small and wrapped inside it, the bracelet, clinking faintly against a parcel of print proofs she had promised to deliver by 9. She hated being late. She hated the way her cheeks warmed when a suit glanced too long at the coffee stain on her blouse. She loved the city in a ragged, practical way, the flavor of rain on concrete, the precise hum of escalators, the anonymous safety of crowds. Today, the city felt like an animal breathing close. Thunder rolled from block to block, each peal pushing her heart a little faster. The elevator door swallowed her up with a clinical ding. Inside, 3 executives with their umbrellas dripping like small, annoyed waterfalls. Secretary Wang with a tote of folders. A delivery boy trying to look invisible. And, as if fate had decided on a dramatic flourish, Ji Hang himself, neat as a seal in his dark overcoat, cufflinks glinting beneath the sheen of rain. He never took public elevators. Today, his presence felt less like coincidence and more like a carefully placed pause. Song Yan's breath bubbled against the elevator's stainless steel as she pressed the button for the 41st floor. The lights flickered once. Someone muttered about the weather. The city exhaled a long electrical sigh. A crack of thunder cleaved the air outside the steel box. For a sliver of a second, the world rearranged itself. The fluorescent light went thin and blue, and Song Yan's skin felt peculiar, as if she were standing a little outside of herself. She reached for the handrail, and the bracelet inside her bag vibrated, a tiny, urgent heartbeat of metal. Then, she wasn't there. No scream, no rippling of fabric. One heartbeat, and the space where she had been was empty. A ghost-shaped absence between Secretary Wang's briefcase and Ji Hang's polished shoe. The parcel sat on the floor, still warm from her palms, the proof sheets fanning out like a startled bird. An umbrella drip plinked onto the floor where her footprints had been, as if reminders would keep the world honest. For half a second, everyone in the elevator assumed trickery. The delivery boy squinted and laughed, pleased with a magic trick he hadn't performed. Were you? Where did she? Secretary Wang's voice was a thin thread of confusion. He fumbled the folders as if a small force had rearranged reality itself. Ji Hang, who always measured people at a distance and classified them by the steadiness of their breath, took one step forward. His eyes searched the empty space as if someone had slid a photograph out of a frame. They landed, then, on the parcel at his feet. He did not blink. He saw what the others did not see, because he could. System. Text-to-speech generation. She stood there in a way that made no sense, an outline softened by rain, the edges of her hair dissolving like ink in water. She looked at him with a small, disbelieving mouth. For her, the elevator felt like a stage on which she'd been exposed in the most personal way. He inhaled, and the rain-scented air of the car felt suddenly intimate, as if he were leaning in close across a private distance. "Song Yan," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Her shoulders hitched so audibly he could have mistaken it for a laugh. How did he know her name? Why could he? The question fizzed up in her like a shaken soda and then sank away because the elevator door dinged and the world reasserted its trivial concerns. A man muttering something about the power grid, someone else checking his watch. The polite modern murmur of discomfort when rules had been broken and nobody wanted to lens themselves into the breach. Ji Heng, who kept his emotions in a sealed envelope, felt something unclasp for one breath. He looked at the place where she had been standing and, without ceremony, reached into his pocket. He did not produce a device or an ancient scroll of explanations. He produced a small, worn metal object. A cufflink he wore every day, a dull black shard set in a simple silver circlet. It had been an unimportant thing until it wasn't. Today, as the elevator hummed, that shard caught the blue light of the flicker and sent out a thin, rippling wave that only seemed to touch her. Song Yan's face softened into an expression he had not earned and would not easily return. Suspicion tempered by relief. "You can see me," she said, the sentence more like a discovery than an accusation. He nodded. "Come with me." Nobody else in the elevator noticed his hand brush hers. Nobody else would later remember that he had kept his voice steady. To the others, there had been a brief interruption of normal service and a long, disagreeable pause while the weather did its worst. For him, the world had acquired a new angle, a private register of things that did not fit into normal inspection. They stepped out into the corridor, rain-slapping and fluorescent blind. Out there, the city smelled of wet concrete and something metallic, like weather shifting its weight. Song Yan pressed her palm against a cold wall, grounding herself. Her pulse jumped against the thin skin of her wrist. Inside the tote, the bracelet lay like a secret bell. She had known the bracelet would do something strange. She had not known it would do it in the presence of him, the man whose name in the world of suits and stakeholders carried a weight almost like a legal sentence. Ji Heng, who kept his emotions in a sealed envelope, felt something unclasp for one breath. He looked at the place where she had been standing and, without ceremony, reached into his pocket. He did not produce a device or an ancient scroll of explanations. He produced a small, worn metal object. A cufflink he wore every day, a dull black shard set in a simple silver circlet. It had been an unimportant thing until it wasn't. Today, as the elevator hummed, that shard caught the blue light of the flicker and sent out a thin, rippling wave that only seemed to touch her. Song Yan's face softened into an expression he had not earned and would not easily return. Suspicion tempered by relief. "You can see me," she said, the sentence more like a discovery than an accusation. He nodded. "Come with me." Nobody else in the elevator noticed his hand brush hers. Nobody else would later remember that he had kept his voice steady. To the others, there had been a brief interruption of normal service and a long, disagreeable pause while the weather did its worst. For him, the world had acquired a new angle, a private register of things that did not fit into normal inspection. They stepped out into the corridor, rain-slapping and fluorescent blind. Out there, the city smelled of wet concrete and something metallic, like weather shifting its weight. Song Yan pressed her palm against a cold wall, grounding herself. Her pulse jumped against the thin skin of her wrist. Inside the tote, the bracelet lay like a secret bell.
She had known the bracelet would do something strange. She had not known it would do it in the presence of him, the man whose name in the world of suits and stakeholders carried a weight almost like a legal sentence. Ji Heng closed the gap between them with the quiet of someone who had practiced restraint and found that restraint breakable. He studied her face as if cataloging which parts were his responsibility now. "You weren't meant to be visible to others," he said.
His voice slid into a lower register. There was, for the first time, an edge of something personal. But you startled everyone. "That's the understatement of the year," she muttered, then laughed, a sound like a falter that surprised and steadied her. Of all the things that could go wrong, to go invisible in the elevator before meeting the executive who always looked at the building as his chessboard, of course. He watched her fingers curl around the strap of her bag, the bracelet. He did not finish because the bracelet's name felt too small to hold the history behind it. She blinked. "It belonged to my mother," she said before he could ask. "She said it would keep me safe when lightning set on the city." There was a long, thin silence. Ji Heng did not smile. He did something far more dangerous for him. He acknowledged curiosity. "Where did you get it?" "Family heirloom, apparently, meteorite. My father sold the rest of the set years ago when things got bad. This one stayed with me. It only works in storms." She tried to make the last sound like a joke. It failed. He looked at the cufflink again, as if the answer lived in the small density of black inside the silver. The two objects humored the same history. Their resonance was not mystical so much as stubbornly physical. He had seen a fragment like that before, years ago, at the edge of a hospital corridor where a boy had lived between breath and non-existence, in a blurred memory that smelled of antiseptic and thunder. He had not known the fragment's origin then. He had only known its feel when it lay close to his skin. "You're not the only one who remembers meteorite iron," he said quietly. "My grandmother, Madame G, once had a piece mounted in a brooch. She believed in omens. She believed in things that made people obvious or invisible in their own houses." He paused, weighing the line between corporate history and personal confessions. It was an odd thing to reveal to an invisible woman on a wet hallway. He revealed it anyway. Song Yan's eyes narrowed with the kind of hostile curiosity that had kept her surviving for years. "So I'm an omen now?" "You are a problem if others think so," he corrected. The phrase came out like a covenant, and problems must be controlled. She wanted to bristle. Instead, she found herself studying his face, the line of jaw, the patient way he listened to words he didn't need to act on. There was something about the way the rain slid off his overcoat that made him look almost tender, an adjective she resented on principle. That human softness would be his dangerousness later, she suspected. For now, it registers as complication. "Aren't you late to a meeting?" she asked, wanting to wedge some ordinary friction into the extraordinary moment. "Later than I planned." He gestured toward the building's service stair without waiting for permission. "Come to my office. We'll talk." He could have dismissed her. He could have turned the moment into rumor and presence and resumed his role as the man who made decisions rather than curiosities. Instead, he led her up 12 flights so the elevator could be spared another metaphysical embarrassment. They passed through warm corridors that smelled of brewed coffee and polished leather. Floors hummed with human commerce. At the 20th level, when they stopped by a glass partition that looked down on the open-plan office, she saw, with a sudden flare of hypocrisy, a dozen people at their desks, heads bent, unaware of the private impossibility that threaded through the day. Ji Hang's office door was quiet. He closed it with a practiced motion that felt like an exclamation point in a sentence he didn't yet understand. The room was spare, a desk with the clean architecture of a man who considered clutter a failure of will. Rain streaked the glass like streaks on a painting. A money tree sculpture sat in one corner, a tasteful reminder of priorities. He did not offer her a chair. He offered instead a small, sympathetic consternation. "Tell me about the last time you remember being visible," he requested. Song Yan sat on the edge of a leather couch, one foot tucked under her like a student who might bolt. She imagined, for a sliver, how this would look in rumor: the CEO and a delivery girl caught in an awkward metaphysical liaison. The thought both amused and frightened her. "The last time I remember anything clearly was before the 14-year storm when we lost the house and my father left. I remember a hospital and my mother saying, 'Don't lose your shadow,' then a car, then nothing, and waking up with a blank where memories should be." Her hands found the strap of her bag and tightened. "Amnesia," Ji Hang said. The word was more clinical than she expected. He had the distance of someone who read files and made judgments based on facts, but now there was empathy braided through his tone. "Tell me about the last time you remember being visible," he requested. Song Yan sat on the edge of a leather couch, one foot tucked under her like a student who might bolt. She imagined, for a sliver, how this would look in rumor: the CEO and a delivery girl caught in an awkward metaphysical liaison. The thought both amused and frightened her. "The last time I remember anything clearly was before the 14-year storm when we lost the house and my father left. I remember a hospital and my mother saying, 'Don't lose your shadow,' then a car, then nothing, and waking up with a blank where memories should be." Her hands found the strap of her bag and tightened. "Amnesia," Ji Hang said. The word was more clinical than she expected. He had the distance of someone who read files and made judgments based on facts, but now there was empathy braided through his tone. "Post-traumatic, that explains holes. It doesn't explain why only certain people can see you now." "You think everyone should see me," she said, sarcastic. "That would make things much simpler." He did not laugh. Instead, he reached into a drawer and set on the desk a small stack of photographs with edges softened by handling. Images of a rainy lane, the curve of a child's wrist with a bracelet that shimmered like a thin memory, a hospital corridor with a late-night fluorescent hush. He tapped the photographs with a finger. "I know where meteorite iron has been used in our family," he said. "Pieces of it have been set into objects for generations. If two fragments resonate, well, there are physical phenomena we can map, even if their effects look like magic." Song Yan looked at the photos, at the bracelet caught mid-glean. So scientifically mystical? Good to have a label. He allowed himself, impossibly, a small smile. Call it resonance. Call it sympathetic vibration. Call it what you like.
The point is text-to-speech generation. The point is, you are not purely invisible in a void. There is a circuit. I can see you because the fragment I wear registers you. Others do not have that circuit. She stared at him. It was a ludicrous truth and a dangerous one. If it spread, if people believed it, then she would be as paper-thin as rumor, folded in the hands of shareholders and relatives. If he kept it secret, then he had leverage. If he used it, then her life would no longer be hers. "Why would you keep this secret?" she asked finally. "Because there are people," he said, and then paused, because saying "in the company" felt too small for the people he meant, who would weaponize what they don't understand. The rain outside the glass pulsed like an answering drum. Somewhere below them, in the heart of the building, someone cursed softly at a cancelled meeting. Samyan's fingers grazed the top of the tote, and, without thinking, she touched the spot where the bracelet thudded like a small, stubborn heart. Ji Hang watched her do it, cataloging the smallness of gestures. "You will need to be careful," he said simply. That phrasing, an order wrapped in concern, unsettled a part of her that had been proud of making her way alone. He isn't offering protection because he is kind, she thought. He is offering it because it serves him. Then she surprised herself by wanting either reason to be true. "And if I refuse?" A long silence. Then, finally, "There will be people who will take advantage. I cannot let that happen." She looked up at the man who spoke like a verdict and felt a curious weariness. Rain made promises of erasure, he had said, but rain could also clean. "Then tell me what to do," she replied, and meant it most passively of all, as a concession, as a plea, as a gamble. He nodded once, a small, private commitment. "Do not wear the bracelet in public when storms are forecast," he advised, which was a ridiculous, inadequate piece of counsel, and also the only practical one. "Keep it wrapped. If you must use it, be where you have control over sightlines." She managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Control lines, right. He hesitated, then, perhaps because the elevator had left an imprint on the day, because the weather had rendered them unlikely conspirators, he offered a detail that felt less managerial and more human. "If you ever need to be seen by someone else for reasons of safety, come to me." The sentence rested between them like a small truce. Outside, the storm rolled its shoulders and prepared to teach the city something else. Inside the tower, two people who should never have been counted as allies found a reason to keep one another's secrets. She had been invisible to the world. She was not invisible to the man who could look at an empty space and find a person. They left the office later with a handful of new arrangements. Ji Hang had a file to open and a mystery that smelled oddly like family superstition. Song Yan had instructions she would obey awkwardly because obedience could be a survival strategy. The rain had not stopped. Thunder promised itself in an undertone, like a secret drum that would call them back to this moment again and again. As they descended in the elevator with the city splashing past the glass, there was a small tilt in the axis of their lives. Unseen to everyone else, the cufflink's black shard and the bracelet in her bag acknowledged each other with a faint, electric whisper. The resonance that allowed Ji Hang to see her had been accidental.
That it existed at all suggested older strings tied between families, between accidents and intentions. It hinted at debts that had not been paid and favors that had not been called. Song Yan watched the rivulets form on the window and thought of her mother whispering about shadows. The thought was a pinch of warmth. Ji Heng watched her watch the rain and thought of the ways the world used things like superstition and inheritance to sort people into boxes. Neither could know then how many times the storm would become an ally, and how many times it would be a sign that someone else was about to pull a thread that would unravel them both. They stepped out into the lobby, wet and quiet, carrying knowledge wrapped like a blade. A security guard glanced at them, saw two ordinary people, and returned to his post. To the city around them, they were invisible artifacts of a normal day. To each other, they were beginning to exist in a relationship the rest of the world had no vocabulary for. The first thunder had done its work. It had made one secret and one promise. The rest would be unraveled in small, stubborn increments. In the hum of boardrooms, in the brittle laughter of family dinners, in the thin light of hospital rooms where memories scraped themselves into being. But for now, the rain sounded like footfalls on a path they were only beginning to walk together. Somewhere in the building a lamp hummed. A money tree cast a tidy shadow. The bracelet in her bag clicked once, insistently, as if to remind her that time had a habit of running out. Ji Heng stepped back into the elevator alone when Song Yan took the stairs to avoid attention, and as the doors closed, he pressed his cufflink to his palm. It warmed under his fingers, ordinary and impossibly charged. He did not yet know whether his seeing her would be salvation or complication. He only knew that when thunder came, she would not be invisible to him. And that knowledge arranged itself in his chest with the calm efficiency of a man cataloging a problem he intended to solve. Ji Heng rode the rest of the way down with his palms still against the cufflink. The warmth had receded to a steady, living pulse, as if something beneath the metal answered to the pressure of his skin.
He walked out into the lobby under the lamp's washed halo and let the rain lay a pattern across his shoulders. He did not hurry. He had the leisure of a man whose calendar filled with other people's emergencies. That leisure now felt like an instrument, precise, patient, and a little hungry. At the security desk, he stopped long enough to sign a guest book the guard offered by habit, the pen tracing his name in a practiced arc. He did not give his destination. The guard glanced at him, indifferent. Everyone at the tower was either someone important or someone who wanted to look and be seen as if they were. Ji Heng liked that indifference. He liked the way a city could be made of anonymous faces and still keep its private currents. Back in his office, he shut the door and let the rain make the windows into a screen. He placed his forearms on the desk and, without theatrics, opened the file he had been meaning to open for a long time. There were folders within folders, court filings, family trees traced in a neat hand, newspaper clippings smudged with tea. He spread them out like a surgeon arranging instruments. The name he had underlined on the elevator, Luo family, wasn't obscure. It turned up in the margins of philanthropy, in the kind of charitable trusts that cleaned public reputations and channeled money into quiet causes.
But the Luo lineage had fissures. An elder who had vanished for a season, a disputed will, a marriage that some papers suggested had been more tactical than romantic. There were also mentions, in older notes he had inherited from a retired researcher, of talismans worn at weddings and wards kept in trunks. Superstition, the files called them, and Ji Heng let himself smile at that word. Superstition was useful. It could be recorded and discounted and used to explain why people did not examine the parts of their lives where power lived. He found a black and white photograph folded between 2 pages, the edges softened by time. A woman in a dark coat stood at the edge of a river, her hair knotted at the nape. Her face was turned away, but the outline of a bracelet was visible on her wrist, a band threaded with a dark stone, a shape he recognized, however faintly, because his cufflink had been cut from a shard like it. He set the photo down and felt the old mechanism click into place. It was a small thing, a genetic memory of possibility. But it altered his priorities like a missing variable in an equation. He made notes, dates, names, movements. The Luo family intersected with the people Song Yun had mentioned only once. An aunt who had folded letters into pockets of winter coats, a physician whose notebooks wrote of shadows as if they were symptoms. He did not yet have causality. He had threads and proximity. That would have to be enough for now. He called his assistant and scheduled a quiet meeting for the next morning.
System. Text-to-speech generation. He drafted an email to an archivist who owed him favors, someone who could pull estate records from the municipal registries without flagging anything on public databases. He did not, however, send the message that wanted to be sent, a blunt, wrong-headed note that would have asked Song Yan to answer questions she might not be ready for. The truce between them felt young and brittle. He would not test it more than necessary. For the rest of the day he worked through the lens of low suspicion and high curiosity, the 2 most effective tools he owned. By the time evening leaked into the city, the rain had slackened into a long, steady skin of drizzle. Ji Heng stood by his office window, watched the water bead and run, and thought about what it meant to make a person visible. There were administrative ways to render someone seen, names on registers, faces in photographs, signatures on deeds. There were moral ways, acknowledgement, apology, return. And then there were the other means, fragments of title, objects that refused to be inert. The cufflink hummed faintly in his pocket when he left. He told himself, with the reassuring voice of habit, that the sensation was a projection of his focus. But when he stepped out on the sidewalk, a man in a thin raincoat crossed his path and glanced at him for a breath too long. The man's eyes flicked not to Ji Heng's face, but to the space where a cufflink might catch the light. Ji Heng felt the warm ping again, as if the shard in his cuff answered when acknowledged by someone who knew how to look. He did not follow the man. Instead, he walked the way people walk when they want to be unobserved among others, measured, unremarkable, both part of the city and apart from it. He thought of Song Yan on the stairs and of the small, absurd pact they had made. "Come to me if you need to be seen," he had said. She had agreed, and in that agreement lay a debt he had not yet counted. Song Yan found the stairs narrow and wet underfoot. She had always preferred stairs for reasons that had nothing to do with prudence. There was a clarity to ascent and descent, an arithmetic of steps that measured exertion and allowed a mind to pace itself. The city smelled of wet concrete and exhaust. It smelled like the place her mother had called home, and like the places she had learned to avoid. On the landing between floors, she paused and listened to the building breathe. In the silence, the bracelet in her bag made a soft, metallic click. At the top of the stairwell, the corridor was lit from a single bulb swinging slightly in the draft. Her apartment door opened to the small, familiar geometry of their life: 2 rooms, a kitchenette, a window that had once framed a rooftop garden, now turned into a small sill for potted herbs. Her mother was in the living room, a shawl across her knees, watching a screen whose light threw a pale rectangle on the ceiling.
Memory had taken to displace itself onto devices and faces. Sometimes the 3 of them would sit in the same room, 2 of them present, and 1 of them inhabiting a photograph. "You're late," her mother said, without looking away. Her voice had a ribbon of dry humor threaded through a tiredness that made it sound like a fact more than a complaint. "I stayed late," Song-Yan said. She took the bag off her shoulder and sat at the edge of the couch. The bracelet did not leave the bag. She had promised herself she would keep it there tonight. Her mother turned then, more aware of her daughter than the screen. There were things that still lit up in her when the right stimuli found purchase: an old song, the smell of tea, the name of a place from before. "Did you see it?" she asked. Song-Yan stared. "See what?" "The storm," her mother said. "The sky. It remembers us." She said the last with a faint, private smile, as if she were revealing the world's secret to someone who might still be young enough to believe in it. Song-Yan did not correct her. She made tea and pretended the ritual was the important thing. The apartment filled with steam and the smell of bergamot, and her mother watched the kettle as if it were an oracle. "You should not wear that in public," her mother said after a long moment, as if they had been talking all along. "It will not keep you whole. It will keep you hidden." She reached into the handbag that lay on the low table and fingered a folded paper map, a thing of creases and notations that belonged to a time when people planned routes physically, with ink. Her hands trembled a little. Song-Yan sat with her palms wrapped around the cup. The bracelet was not only an object, it was a grammar for the way the world responded to her. It allowed absence to be an ally. It allowed escape. But escape required lying in wait. She had become practiced at the small falsehoods that kept her alive. "Why give it to me?" she asked. "Why now?" Her mother shrugged, and her shoulders was like a bow under load. "Because the world forgets. That is the kind of kindness when you have nothing else to give. Because someone once said we should keep it out of sight when storms come. Because your father used to say shadows could be bargained with." The name moved like a stone through the water. Song-Yan did not ask for details. Her father's presence was a variable that had long ago been settled. He had left and returned in different shapes: letters, promises, a hospital bed that ached with the outline of someone who tried to hold on to memories. To ask the how or the why felt like starting a machine that could not be stopped. She wanted to know, and she wanted not to know simultaneously. The television hummed behind them with a story about the storm. Streets flooded, traffic tangled, 3 people rescued from a roof. Ordinary human things. System.
Text-to-speech generation. Mayo, maintain the flux and the connection. Connect with Levision hummed behind them with a story about the storm. Streets flooded, traffic tangled, 3 people rescued from a roof. Ordinary human things. Someone on the screen was being interviewed and cried in a way that made Song-yeon think of what her voice might sound like when it needed someone to look at it. She kept the bracelet in the bag. That night she sat awake while the rain pattered and went to the window and watched the city smear. She thought of the guard who had glanced at them in the lobby and the small truce with Ji-hang. She thought of the photograph of the woman at a river and the shard of stone caught in intractable dignity. It might have been any woman's wrist in the photograph. That was how talismans worked. They belonged to many hands over the years and to an intention that outlived the people who first willed them. In the dark, her phone buzzed once, not a call but a message from an old friend. She did not open it. She did not know why it mattered that she had not. The bracelet clicked in the bag, like a tick of a clock that had decided to be honest about its whereabouts. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the rain-damp city, a woman who wore the mark of an older grief stepped into the threshold of a hospital ward. The fluorescent lights introduced themselves like a sterile confession. She held a tiny paper bag of pastries as though it were an offering and scanned for a nameplate. This was the hospital Song-yeon's mother had avoided. Here, memory was advice and memory was expense, and the staff moved like people who had learned to live with small devastations. Song-yeon arrived later, the collar of her coat damp, the bracelet hidden beneath the cuff of her sleeve. The ward smelled of disinfectant and lemon and the quiet machinery of expectation. She found her father's room by the crooked way the bed faced the window and the photograph taped to the headboard. Someone had stuck a grainy image of better weather where he could look at it. He was older in a way that rearranged him. Age had not softened the edges, it had clarified them. He turned his head when she came in, and for a moment there was a bright, startled recognition, the animal happiness that comes when a living person returns to your orbit. "Jan," he said, not a name, but a benediction. It made the room tilt. She sat on the chair by the bed and reached for his hand. It was thinner than she remembered and smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the cologne he had worn when he thought people needed to be impressed. He smiled at her with the patient victory of someone who likes the present more than the past. "I thought you might not come," he said. "I came," she said. She spoke with the economy of someone who had practiced presence as a skill. She told him about the rain and about nothing, and she watched how fragments of conversation put him together for a little while longer. A nurse came in, adjusted a monitor, and left with the soft efficiency of a person who tends to fragility with the boredom that keeps them human. After a while, he closed his eyes.
System. Text-to-speech generation. Song-yeon sat there and listened to the machines and the distant wet sounds of the city. She felt the bracelet under her sleeve, its metal a cold promise. She thought of Ji-hang and the file, of a photograph that linked strangers, of the way people used objects to tell stories about who they were and who had ownership over them. There was a moral calculus she could not solve in a hospital chair. On her way out, she paused at the nurse's station and conversed with a young woman who recognized her by the way she walked, a graceless, competent step. "Your father asked after you," the nurse said. The tone was both report and encouragement. "He is here because of me," Song-yeon said.
The phrase was both true and incomplete. He is stubborn. The nurse smiled, warm and exhausted. Good stubbornness, she offered. That keeps people alive. Song Yan let the compliment sit like an amber leaf. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, and the city smelled of wet pavement and a kind of clean possibility. She walked home under a sky clearing into a rare, cold clarity. At an intersection, a man in a coat turned and watched her as she passed. He had seen her, she felt it like the brush of a finger, and for a breath she considered stopping, but she did not. People who had learned to live as if they were not always felt the presence of eyes as a physical pressure. Sometimes it was curiosity, sometimes hunger. She wrapped the bag closer around her and walked on. Ji Heng, sitting at a diner tonight because the rain had kept his appetite from behaving like a demand, watched the city go by. He had placed the photograph face up on the table between his coffee and his hand. A waitress refilled his cup without asking. She had the kind of habit that birthed small conversations, but he declined. He was becoming a man of focused patience. The picture was an instrument that promised him further information if he would let it. His cufflink warmed again, and he looked up, not at the street, but at the way light bent off the window. Across the road, a taxi idled, and a passenger in the back seat leaned forward to glance at the sidewalk. For a moment, Ji Heng's attention snapped to the glass between him and the street, and in that reflection he saw another reflection, the outline of a bracelet at someone's wrist, barely there, a notch of shadow, like the dark stone in his hand. It might have been a trick of light, a coincidence, a play of wet glass and tired eyes. But the cufflink in his pocket answered with a thrum, and in his mind a ledger of names rearranged itself. The city was small in its repetitions. Objects recirculated, people returned, debts turned up in unexpected accounts. He understood then, without being certain, that this was not an isolated artifact. Something had moved between families, between hands, and the movement had the shape of intention. He paid his bill. When he stepped outside, the drizzle had given way to a thin moon.
The streets smelled of ozone and the scraped, metallic tang of a city wrung clean. He walked without a destination, allowing the map of intersections to determine his route. He was careful not to be seen as searching, though he would have been hard-pressed to explain to himself why he felt compelled to find Song Yen again that night. Unseen, another person moved in the same pattern of streets. He carried a device not for listening, but for watching, a string of small anomalies he tracked like a habit. He had noticed a pattern of objects appearing and then being hidden, of people who seemed to be both present and not. He paused in a doorway and pulled up a photograph on an old phone. The image displayed a bracelet, one similar to the one that resonated now in Ji Heng's pocket. The man smiled without warmth. For him, the world was a ledger too, and every ledger was a set of accounts to be balanced. The city, reborn in the aftermath of rain, kept its own counsel. It would keep secrets if given cause, and it would reveal them when pulled like a thread through an eye. Ji Heng walked on, step and thought aligning, the night moving around him like a tide. Song Yen slept at the edge of a bed that smelled faintly of bergamot and hospital lemon, the bracelet safe in her bag.
Somewhere between them, the shard and the band knew one another across a distance of small choices. When he passed the tower again, the light in the lobby glowed. A security guard nodded as he walked by. The world was maintained by nods and small routines. Ji Heng kept moving, his palm in his pocket like a man holding a small lit match, careful not to let it go out, cautious about the flame's reach. The weather had done its first work, made people readable in ways they had not planned for. The rest would be slower, inquiries that began as curiosity and hardened into obligation. Family dinners where what was unsaid settled like sediment. Hospital corridors where memory and error rubbed against one another until they produced narrative. He thought of the truce again and the neat professional ways one could keep a promise. He resolved to keep his. Across the city, a different man in a different coat snapped a photograph of nothing in particular. The reflection of a bracelet on a window, the echo of a cufflink in glass. He sent the image to an address with the single line, "Found one." The reply did not come quickly, but the device registered a ping, as if to say, "Noted." Night advanced. The rain ghosts were leaving puddles that reflected distant lights like small mirrors strewn across the pavement. Ji Heng walked into the dark and kept the photograph folded in his breast pocket. It was a small, practical act. He did not yet know whether it would be mercy or ruin for the woman who had shared a stairwell with him, but he knew the city had begun to write their names in the same ledger. And somewhere, in the thin hour when the world readjusted itself to being awake, the bracelet in Song Yan's bag clicked once, a sound that reached across the city's geometry like a small bell. It was a private sound, but not an insignificant one. It marked a presence, and, perhaps more dangerously, an invitation. Outside, a thunderhead that had been reluctant earlier drifted away, leaving the sky to unfasten into a clarity that looked like truth. Inside, two people who had promised a secret to one another slept with different kinds of alarms in their chests. One, the simple, professional readiness of a man cataloging a problem. The other, the harder, private alertness of a woman who had learned how fragile visibility could be. Neither of them would fully understand the shape of what had begun until enough threads had been pulled. For now, the city breathed, and the shard and the band hummed in the small electric silence that sits between a question and its consequence. Song Yan stirred as if the sound had crossed the thin membrane between sleep and waking. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the room. The faint hum of a refrigerator, air moving through vents, the distant thud of a subway train. The bracelet's click had been a single, deliberate punctuation, neither alarm nor accident, and for a moment she allowed herself to think it might have been something in a dream. She reached into the bag without rising fully, fingers finding fabric and zipper with the ease of habit. When she drew the bracelet into the light, it looked smaller than in memory, a band of dull metal with a seam that caught the moon through the curtains. She turned it over in her hand, watching the way the moonlight looked ordinary on ordinary things, as if nothing further could be asked of them. There was, beneath the metal, a faint warmth. Song Yan frowned. She had not expected that. She felt foolish for being startled by a piece of discarded jewelry. She had learned over years to mistrust her own instincts. But the warmth was a fact. She set the band on the bedside table and sat up, the bed sighing under her. Outside, a tram carried on, indifferent. She remembered the stairwell and the man with the ash-gray coat. She remembered the shard and the way Ji Heng's apology had been small and precise. Memory came sometimes like a sink turned on, slow at first, then gathering speed. Sometimes it failed altogether. Tonight, the name on the edge of remembrance arrived complete and limpid. Ji Heng. She pressed her palm to her mouth as if testing whether speech could still form in that space. The bracelet clicked again, softer this time, as if answering some inner instruction. Song Yan watched it and found she could neither name the sound nor dismiss it. She thought, absurdly, of old folk tales, tokens that summoned roads, keys that opened storms, and, after a few beats, of rational explanations. Batteries, sensors, a mechanism intentionally set to warn or to call. She rose, moving barefoot to the window. The city arranged itself in luminous geometrices, a grid of streetlights, the sudden ribbon of a passing car. When she turned back, the bracelet had pulsed very slightly, like a living thing considering speech. Something inside her tightened, a readiness she had cultivated so that small shocks did not topple her whole life. She took the band and slipped it around her wrist. It fit as though it had been measured for her. The metal sat against skin, and at once the world felt more closely aligned, as though a fraction of distance had been folded inward. She heard her own breathing, slow and even. Then the click again. Then, beneath the click, a whisper of something else. A sound like a distant bell, modulated, nearly inaudible. And for a second she imagined she could hear footsteps threading the night. Miles away, Ji Heng moved with the kind of attention that had once been called profession, but now felt more like an arrangement of habits acquired to keep himself useful to someone or something. He had no idea where Song Yan slept, only a guess shaped by the aftertaste of a conversation and a street memory. He walked faster, keeping to alleys and under eaves, avoiding the main boulevards where the cameras watched with indifferent lenses. He unfolded the photograph and pressed it against his chest, feeling the paper's coolness through fabric. The photograph was a fragment, cropped and blurred at the edges, the bracelet reflected in a shop window, a smear of light catching at its seam. He thought of the ledger keeper who smiled without warmth. The man who tracked things like transactions and omissions had noticed the bracelet and had transmitted a note to somewhere Ji Heng could not yet see. That small act found one, pried at the world's neat surfaces, and let a shadow leak through. Ji Heng kept his promise to himself and to the truce. Avoid searching, avoid asking too many questions that could become obligations. But a promise is often only as strong as the person who keeps it, and promises made to ghosts or to partial intimacies have a way of loosening. He had paid his bill. He had stepped into the night. Each step now pulled him toward a person he had barely known, and toward a bracelet that had already begun to arrange facts he could neither name nor deny. Somewhere else, the watcher with the device adjusted a dial that blinked amber. His photograph had been sent to a central feed, the bracelet's pattern registered as a flagged element, associated with a cluster of other small anomalies, missing persons, a string of late-night purchases linked to unlisted accounts, a tiny registry of gestures. He waited for a reply with the patience of a man who kept ledgers and did not believe in hurry.
The reply came back, "Consolidate, follow the nearest trace." The watcher smiled again. Consolidation made his work tidy. He moved quietly, stepping into the map of streets like a man pruning a garden.
He traced the route that Ji Heng might be taking. He overlapped it in his head with data he had collected, stores that sold components, repair kiosks, pawn shops that traded in clean circuits. He imagined brief stops, a hands-on inspection, a reckoning with a seam, a decision whether to reveal or to conceal. Song Yan walked into the kitchen and made tea without turning on more light than necessary. The kettle sighed, and she cupped her hands around a ceramic mug, warmth seeping to her fingers like a small concession. She wanted to be alone with the bracelet, to examine it without an audience or the press of implication. Curiosity and fear sat side by side. She indulged the smaller, kinder feeling. The bracelet warmed at the touch, then shifted its alignment, and the seam opened like a throat. Inside, nestled in a shallow groove, lay a sliver of something that was not metal. A tiny shard, glass-faced and deliberate, etched with marks like a script too small to read. She almost laughed because the shard's presence made everything that had come before, awkward meetings, a stairwell promise, Ji Heng's folded photograph, feel inevitable. She had been given one more thing to understand. She had been given a clue. She set the shard on the table and looked at it as if it might tell her how to proceed. In the shard's edge, she could see a bakery across the street, neon inverted, a man with a hat passing. There was also, if she leaned forward and cupped her eyes, something like motion within the shard, a flitter, an angle of light that repeated. It was not a reflection alone. It was a small, repeated event inside the glass, like a trapped insect beating at air. Song Yan had learned to test things. She held the shard up and listened. At first, there was only the hum of the city. Then, when she tilted it in a particular way, a thin voice threaded itself into the room. It was not intelligible as speech. It resembled the after-image of speech, the suggestion of consonants. Her skin prickled. The shard returned to silence as if exhausted. She kept the band loosely on her wrist and sat, the kettle cooling, the shard and the bracelet arranged between her and the room. She knew the city had begun to write their names in the same ledger. That knowledge could be a promise or a threat. She did not yet know which. Ji Heng had reached the corner of a street that bore the smell of frying oil and something sweeter, like jasmine from a terrace above. He stopped beneath a neon sign that had lost half its letters and looked up at the apartments. He imagined, for no rational reason, the exact pattern of light on a second-floor windowsill and felt a small, foolish hope that Song Yan would appear there and simply wave. He folded the photograph again and, with a steadier hand, placed it in the pocket closer to his heart. He told himself he would walk past her building once and no more. He told himself he would not press fates that were not his to press. But a promise kept by motion is still a promise, and motion carried him forward until he stood, without exactly planning to, before a narrow stairwell whose number had been in his peripheral vision earlier that day. Inside, the stairwell smelled of damp plaster and old paint. The light was a rectangle at the far end, and the sound of Song Yan making tea threaded through like an honest thing. Ji Heng held himself to a quietness he had practiced for years. There are people whose lives are a quietness, and there are people whose lives are noise. He had learned to be the former, and he listened for any indication she wanted him to know she had forgiven him or that she did not want to. At the bottom of the stairs, a figure paused. It was not the watcher with the ledger and the device. It was a lean man in a jacket that had seen better days. He carried nothing obvious and looked as if he belonged to the architecture of steps and handrails. He looked up at Ji Heng, and for an instant their eyes locked. There was a recognition there that did not include a name. Ji Heng nodded once, the small nod of a man acknowledging a fellow traveler on a route. The man returned the nod and moved on, his shoes whispering on concrete. Ji Heng took the stairs softly, each step a deliberate assent to the decision he had not yet taken. Song Yan heard the steps as a different sound altogether. Ordinary feet, reverent feet, the feet of someone who meant no immediate harm. She set the shard down and moved to the door. The corridor smelled of laundry, a neighbor's cooking, a child asleep somewhere. When she opened the door, a man was there on the landing, breathing out creased air. He looked like he had been carved from the same evening. Rain-dark hair, a coat with the shoulders of someone accustomed to carrying burdens. For a second, the city held its breath like a paused photograph. The bracelet warmed against Song Yan's wrist. Ji Heng lifted his hand in a motion that was at once apologetic and businesslike. "You shouldn't have come," she said. Not a reproach, but a simple observation, as if the fact could be catalogued and placed on a shelf. The truce hummed between them like a low wire. "I know," he answered. "I broke it the moment I saw your bracelet again." They stood in the doorway together, two people with histories too complicated for a simple apology. Behind them, the stairwell swallowed the rest of the building's sounds. Somewhere down the street, a car alarm chirped and was quiet. Above, a slice of clear sky promised no immediate storms. Neither of them yet knew the size of what had been set in motion. Who had marked the bracelet? Who had catalogued the shard? Which hands had inked their names into the ledger? But the city had already begun to align its instruments to the pattern. The notebook men, the watchers, the little devices were all now actors in a drama the two of them could feel but not yet name. Ji Heng drew a breath that tasted faintly of jasmine and the night. "Tell me what it does," he said. "Tell me what it is." Song Yan looked at the band on her wrist and then at the shard on the table. Her fingers hovered for a moment, then curled around the metal like a small private oath. "It calls," she said. "It calls, but not always to the same place." She smiled without humor and let the smile be a fact rather than an instruction. Sometimes it calls home. Sometimes it calls trouble. They stood there, the three items between them, the bracelet, the shard, the photograph folded in Ji Heng's pocket, each small and dangerous and insistently meaningful. On the street below, the watcher keyed a message into a device and received the quick ping of acknowledgement. The city, patient as always, readied itself for what would come next. Neither of them yet knew what answer would be pulled from the ledger. They only felt the first tremor of questions, as if the ground beneath the city's neat geometry had begun to shift. Outside, beyond the stairwell and the soft rectangle of light, a street light blinked, and for a moment, the night seemed to hold its balance between revelation and concealment. Inside, time tightened around the pair like a belt fastened with care. The bracelet pulsed once, quietly, in the space of that tightening. Song-Yan watched it and felt the world tilt a degree she could not measure. A knock sounded at the door below, the kind that was practiced, the kind that did not ask permission, but expected it. They both heard it at once. The knock was a new sound in a story that had already begun to write itself. Ji Hang's hand went empty into his pocket and came back with the photograph flattened between thumb and palm. He wanted, absurdly, to protect nothing more than the memory of an accidental meeting. He stepped forward and, with a slow, steady motion, moved toward the hall, while Song-Yan watched the bracelet on her wrist and the shard on the table, and the city outside measured out steps and responses as if keeping time to a song neither of them fully knew.